Hello. Welcome back to STM Narratives. Before we begin, please comment where you are watching from and the time. On a quiet autumn afternoon, when indifference seemed to rule the world, a boy named Jason performed an act of selflessness that rippled through an entire community. After witnessing an elderly woman, Mrs. Adelaide, fall and injure herself on a deserted street, Jason sacrificed his own comfort to save her. Tearing his shirt to stop her bleeding and guiding her to safety, his actions demonstrated the power of compassion in the face of apathy. This is their unforgettable story. Maplewood was a small town where the streets hummed with the quiet rhythm of life. The leaves, burnished gold and amber, drifted lazily to the ground. The air carried a crisp chill, signaling that winter was not far behind. Mrs. Adelaide, a fiercely independent 78-year-old widow, was on her weekly trip to the market. Her tall, thin frame moved with a dignity that belied her age, though her joints often reminded her of their wear and tear. Her wicker basket, now heavier with fresh produce, weighed down her left arm as she navigated the uneven cobblestone path. As she approached a familiar intersection, a sudden misstep on a loose stone sent her sprawling. Her basket flew from her hands, apples and bread tumbling onto the street. She landed hard on her right side, a sharp pain shooting through her wrist and arm. The cold sting of the pavement bit through her cardigan. Mrs. Adelaide winced, clutching her arm. Blood oozed from a jagged cut on her forearm, staining her beige sweater. She cried out, but her voice seemed to dissolve into the empty air. "Help!" she called, her voice quivering with fear. A few pedestrians walked by, their heads lowered, their pace quickened. Cars zipped by on the adjacent road, drivers oblivious or uninterested. Mrs. Adelaide's chest tightened with despair. She felt invisible, discarded by a world too busy to care. Jason was 12 years old, with a slim build, dark skin that glowed in the sunlight, and large, expressive eyes that sparkled with curiosity and kindness. He was well known in the neighborhood, often seen helping his mother sell homemade goods at the market or playing soccer with friends in the park. Despite his family's struggles, Jason carried himself with a quiet confidence. His mother had always instilled in him the importance of integrity, teaching him that true wealth lay in the kindness of one's heart. That afternoon, Jason had just left the market, his pocket jingling with a few coins he'd earned. He planned to surprise his younger sister with her favorite candy. But as he turned onto Adelaide Street, he spotted the elderly woman lying on the ground. His heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, he ran to her side. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Jason asked, his voice laced with concern. Mrs. Adelaide looked up, her eyes wide with relief and pain. I think I broke my wrist. And my arm, it's bleeding." Jason crouched beside her, examining the wound. Blood trickled steadily from the cut on her forearm. He glanced around, searching for help, but the street remained desolate. "Don't worry, ma'am," Jason said firmly. "I'll take care of you." Jason's mind raced. He knew he had to stop the bleeding, but he had nothing with him. His gaze fell to his own t-shirt, a favorite item of clothing his mother had patched countless times. It was old but clean, one of the few he owned. Without a second thought, Jason grabbed the hem and began tearing. The fabric gave way under his determined hands, and soon he had several strips of cloth. "Hold still," he said gently. He wrapped the strips around her arm, tying them tightly but carefully over the wound. Mrs. Adelaide watched in stunned silence. You're tearing your shirt for me?" she murmured, her voice breaking. Jason smiled softly. "It's just a shirt, ma'am. You're more important." Tears pooled in Mrs. Adelaide's eyes. She had always seen the world as a place where people looked out for themselves. But here was a boy, sacrificing what little he had for her sake. With the makeshift bandage in place, Jason extended his hand. "Can you stand, ma'am?" Mrs. Adelaide nodded, but struggled to rise. Jason slid an arm around her waist, steadying her. Together, they began the slow journey to the nearest clinic, several blocks away. As they walked, Jason chatted to distract her from the pain. "My mom always says we should help people when we can," he said. "She says kindness doesn't cost anything." Mrs. Adelaide listened, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had lived alone for years, her interactions with others often limited to curt exchanges at the market. Jason's warmth was a balm to her soul. By the time they reached the clinic, both were exhausted. Jason's shirtless frame shivered slightly in the crisp air, but he didn't complain. His focus remained on Mrs. Adelaide. The receptionist's eyes widened as Jason guided Mrs. Adelaide through the door. "We need help," Jason called out. A nurse rushed over, and within minutes, Mrs. Adelaide was seated in an examination room. Jason stood by her side, his face etched with concern. As the doctor examined her injuries, Mrs. Adelaide recounted the events with a trembling voice. "This boy saved me," she said, her gaze fixed on Jason. "He tore his own shirt to stop my bleeding." The nurse and doctor exchanged impressed glances. "That was very brave of you," the nurse said, smiling at Jason. Jason shrugged modestly. "I just did what anyone would do." But Mrs. Adelaide knew better. Once her wounds were cleaned and her wrists set in a cast, Mrs. Adelaide was wheeled back to the waiting room. Jason sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Mrs. Adelaide turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Jason, I don't have enough words to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me today than anyone else has in years." Jason smiled, his eyes shining. "It's okay, ma'am. I'm just glad you're feeling better." That simple, sincere statement brought the tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in years, Mrs. Adelaide felt truly seen and cared for. Word of Jason's heroism spread quickly through Maplewood. The local newspaper featured an article about the boy who had selflessly helped an injured elderly woman, calling him a local hero. Neighbors who had once overlooked Jason and his family began to show their admiration. Some offered donations of clothing and supplies, while others simply stopped to thank him for his kindness. Mrs. Adelaide, now recovering at home, insisted on having Jason and his family over for dinner. It was her way of repaying their kindness and forging a deeper connection with the boy who had touched her heart. Over time, Jason and Mrs. Adelaide became inseparable. She taught him how to bake, shared stories from her youth, and helped him with schoolwork. In return, Jason ran errands for her, fixed things around her house, and filled her once lonely home with laughter. Jason's act of kindness not only saved Mrs. Adelaide, but also transformed both of their lives. The bond they formed reminded everyone in Maplewood of the power of compassion and the enduring impact of a selfless act. Years later, when Jason was asked about that day, he always said the same thing. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what was right." But to Mrs. Adelaide, and to everyone who heard their story, Jason's actions were extraordinary. His kindness became a beacon of hope, proving that even in a world full of indifference, one person's selflessness can make all the difference. Thank you for watching. If you would like to see more stories like these, don't forget to subscribe.